Step aside, lady. We aren't playing little school games today. Move it.
You cannot enter this building. Where is the warrant? Show me.
You blocking a federal operation? That's a nice way to get cuffs on, sweetheart.
I am protecting my students. No warrant, no entry.
Last
Period.
warning, get out of the way. You're coming.
The security footage from that Tuesday morning doesn't look like the start of a historic civil rights battle. It looks mundane, almost boring, until you notice the timestamp freezing at 10:42 a.m. That was the minute the world inside Distinctive Learning Charter School stopped turning. The sun was cutting through the high windows of the vestibule, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, unaware that the atmosphere was about to become unbreathable. Kiara Robinson stood on the safe side of the double-locked security doors. She wasn't supposed to be at the front desk. She was supposed to be in room 304 teaching the carbon cycle to a group of 7th graders who had finally, after weeks of struggle, started to understand the concept of photosynthesis. But the front office administrator was out sick, and during her prep period, Kiara had offered to cover the phones. It was a small act of kindness, typical of her, a way to help the ecosystem of the school function a little smoother. She held a stack of graded quizzes in one hand and a cooling cup of peppermint tea in the other. Then the buzzer rang. It wasn't the rhythmic, polite buzz of a parent dropping off a forgotten lunchbox. It was a long, insistent drone that vibrated through the cheap plastic of the intercom unit. Kiara set her tea down. She checked the monitor. Her heart performed a strange, painful flip in her chest, a physical reaction to a visual threat that her brain hadn't quite processed yet. Standing outside the glass doors were 3 men. They were not wearing the standard uniforms of the local Chicago Police Department. They were dressed in heavy tactical gear, the kind usually reserved for raids on fortified compounds, not visits to a middle school known for its community garden. They wore plate carriers with police emblazoned in generic bold yellow letters across the chest, but underneath, in smaller print, was the actual agency designation ICE. Their faces were obscured by balaclavas, leaving only their eyes visible. On their hips, heavy service weapons sat in drop-leg holsters. Kiara pressed the talk button. Her finger trembled just once before she locked her hand into a fist. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, dropping an octave instinctively. It was her teacher voice, the tone she used to break up fights in the cafeteria without raising a shout. The man in the center, the one who seemed to radiate a coiled, aggressive energy, stepped closer to the camera. This was Brock Delaney. He didn't look at the lens. He looked through the glass, trying to intimidate the person he couldn't see clearly yet. "Open the door," Delaney said. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the boredom of someone who rarely hears the word no. "I need to know who you are and why you're here," Kiara replied. She didn't buzz them in. The magnetic lock on the door hummed a low-frequency sound that suddenly felt like the only shield between her students and chaos. "Federal agents," Delaney barked. "We have a warrant for an individual believed to be on these premises. Open the door now or you'll be facing obstruction charges." The word warrant usually works like a magic spell. It makes knees weak and doors open. But Kiara Robinson wasn't just a teacher. She was a protector of a very specific fragile sanctuary. She had spent 15 years in this district. She knew these families. She knew that Marcus in the 3rd row of her homeroom was terrified of loud noises because of what happened to his uncle. She knew that Sophia, who wanted to be a marine biologist, brought her grandmother's tamales to school on Fridays. These weren't just names on a roster. They were the people she had promised to keep safe the moment they walked into her classroom. Kiara looked at the monitor again. There was no paper visible in Delaney's hand. "Please hold the warrant up to the glass so I can read it," Kiara said. There was a pause. Outside, the wind whipped around the brick corner of the building, fluttering the tactical straps on Delaney's vest. He looked at his partners, then back at the door. "I'm not playing games with you! Lady!" Delaney shouted, his voice muffled slightly by the thick safety glass, but clearly audible through the intercom. "This is a federal operation. Open this door immediately." Inside the office, the air grew thick. Mr. Evans, the young history teacher who was grabbing photocopies from the machine in the corner, stopped mid-step. He was new, fresh out of college, with a student loan debt that kept him up at night and a natural deference to authority. He looked at Kiara, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Kiara," he whispered the name hissing out. "It's the feds. You have to let them in. You can't block them. They have guns." Kiara didn't turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the monitor on the 3 armed men standing 10 feet from the entrance where 6th graders walked in every morning. "They have guns," Kiara acknowledged, her voice low. "Which is exactly why they aren't coming in without a judge's signature. Mr. Evans, go to the principal's office. Tell Principal Davies we have a code yellow at the front. Tell her to call legal. Now." Evans hesitated. He looked at the door where Delaney was now pounding on the glass frame with the heel of his hand, a dull, rhythmic thud that echoed through the vestibule. "Go," Kiara snapped. It was the command of a veteran educator. Evans dropped his papers and ran. Kiara turned back to the intercom. She took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of dry erase markers and floor wax, the smell of school. She pressed the button again. "Sir, I am asking you to display the warrant. If you have a warrant signed by a judge, I will comply. If you do not, you are trespassing on school property." Delaney's eyes narrowed. He pulled a folded paper from a pouch on his vest and slapped it against the glass. Kiara leaned forward, squinting. The camera resolution was decent, but the paper was wrinkled, and the glare from the sun made it hard to read. However, she could see the header. It was a standard administrative form, an I-200. It was an order of removal/arrest issued by an immigration officer, not a judicial warrant signed by a court judge. It gave them no authority to enter a private area or a school without consent. She had learned this. She had attended the Know Your Rights workshops organized by the Teachers Union 3 years ago, sitting in a folding chair in the gymnasium on a Saturday, taking notes while eating a cold bagel. She remembered the lawyer saying, "Administrative warrants do not grant entry. Only a judicial warrant does that. Know the difference. It's the difference between a search and a violation. That is an administrative warrant," Kiara said, her voice projecting through the external speaker. "That does not give you the right to enter this building without our consent, and we do not consent." Delaney looked like he had been slapped. He pulled the paper down and stepped closer, his face inches from the glass. "Listen to me, you stupid!" He caught himself, the slur dying in his throat but hovering in the air. "You are interfering with a federal investigation. I can have you in cuffs in 30 seconds. I can have this whole building shut down. Do you want to lose your license? Do you want to go to jail today?" This was the spark, the threat. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about power. It was about a man in tactical gear realizing that a black woman in a cardigan was telling him no, and his brain couldn't compute the equation. Kiara felt the fear then. It was a cold wash of water down her spine. She thought of her own son, a sophomore in high school. She thought of her pension. She thought of the headline teacher arrested at school. She knew how that story would be spun. She would be the angry, non-compliant woman who endangered children. But then she looked past Delaney to the playground visible in the background of the camera shot. It was empty now, but in an hour it would be full of noise and life. If she opened this door, she broke the seal. If she let them in without a judge's order, she was telling every student in that building that their safety was conditional, that their sanctuary was an illusion. "I am protecting my students," Kiara said. "You are not coming in." Inside the office, the door to the inner corridor burst open. Principal Davies arrived breathless, her phone pressed to her ear. She was a short woman with graying hair and a spine of steel, but she looked pale. "Kiara," she said, "I have general counsel on the line." She hit the speaker button on her cell phone and placed it on the desk next to the intercom console. "This is Sarah Jenkins, District General Counsel," a voice boomed from the tiny speaker. "Who am I speaking with?" Kiara pressed the intercom button so the lawyer could hear the outside audio, creating a bridge between the three parties. "We have Agent..." She looked at the monitor. "Agent Delaney and 2 others at the front door. They have an administrative warrant only. They are demanding entry." "Agent Delaney," the lawyer's voice was crisp, cutting through the static. "This is District Counsel. You are aware that under the 4th Amendment, an administrative warrant does not grant you authority to enter non-public areas of this school, unless you have a judicial warrant signed by an Article 3 judge, or exigent circumstances involving immediate danger to life, you must leave the premises." Delaney stared at the intercom speaker as if it were an alien artifact. He looked at the camera, then at the door handle. He reached out and rattled it violently. The metal clanged a harsh, jarring sound that made Kiara flinch. "We have probable cause to believe the subject is inside," Delaney shouted. "We are coming in." "If you breach that door," the lawyer said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, "it will be a violation of federal law and a civil rights violation. We are recording this interaction. The security footage is being backed up to a remote server as we speak." This was the first anchor. The mention of the remote backup was a bluff. The system backed up every 24 hours, not live, but it was a plausible plain language check on his power. It told him that the evidence wasn't something he could confiscate or delete. Delaney froze. His hand was still on the door handle. He looked at his partners. One of them, a taller man who had been hanging back, shook his head slightly. He tapped his own wrist, signaling time or perhaps a limit to how far he was willing to go. But Delaney wasn't done. He leaned into the glass again. "You're making a mistake," he hissed at Kiara. "A big one. We're going to flag your file. We're going to check every credential you have. You think you're safe in there?" It was a direct threat to her livelihood, a promise of bureaucratic retribution. "I'm doing my job," Kiara said. "Please step away from the door." The standoff lasted for another 4 minutes. 4 minutes of Delaney pacing the small concrete landing. 4 minutes of him making phone calls on his own device, looking back at the camera with disdain. 4 minutes of Kiara standing perfectly still, her hand hovering over the lock button that was already engaged, just to be sure. Mr. Evans, who had returned with the principal, was filming the monitor screen with his personal cell phone. His hands were shaking so bad the video would later be dizzying to watch, but he didn't stop recording. Finally, Delaney spat on the ground. He signaled to his team, "Let's go. We'll be back with the cavalry." They retreated to an unmarked SUV parked in the fire lane and drove off. Only when the car turned the corner did Kiara Robinson exhale. Her legs gave out and she sank into the office chair. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. She began to shake her teeth, chattering. Principal Davies put a hand on her shoulder, squeezing tight. "You did good, Kiara," Davies whispered. "My God, you did good." But it wasn't over. The SUV leaving was just the end of the first act. The real war was about to begin. 3 days later, the summons arrived. Not for the school, but for Kiara personally. She was being investigated for obstruction of justice and interfering with federal law enforcement duties. Simultaneously, the school district received a notification that Distinctive Learning Charter was under review for non-compliance with federal safety standards. A vague threat that could pull their funding. The narrative started to form in the local whispers. The difficult teacher. The radical school that hated law enforcement. Delaney had filed a report painting a very different picture. In his version, he had seen a fugitive fleeing into the building, a lie, and Kiara had physically barred them from pursuing a dangerous criminal, also a lie as the doors were locked. Kiara sat in her living room staring at the legal papers. Her dining table, usually covered in science lesson plans and potting soil for her home garden, was now buried under legal threats. She felt small. She felt the crushing weight of the machinery she had thrown a wrench into. "Why not just settle?" her brother asked over the phone. "Apologize, pay a fine, make it go away. They'll ruin you, Ki." "I can't," Kiara said, looking at a picture of her homeroom class on the fridge. "If I apologize, I'm saying they were right. I'm saying they can come in whenever they want. And if I say that, how do I look Marcus in the eye? How do I tell Sophia she's safe?" She chose to fight, and she didn't fight alone. The solidarity began quietly. It started with the parents. When the news broke that Ms. Robinson was being targeted, the PTA didn't buckle. They mobilized. A group of mothers, led by Sophia's grandmother, organized a human shield watch schedule. Every morning for 3 weeks, fathers and mothers stood on the sidewalk outside the school drinking coffee, watching for unmarked SUVs. They weren't violent. They just stood there, witnesses with smartphones. Then came the legal team. The story had leaked to a civil rights firm in downtown Chicago. They took the case pro bono. They weren't interested in a settlement. They smelled blood. They filed a massive countersuit alleging Fourth Amendment violations, excessive force assault, and malicious prosecution. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was brutal. The government lawyers tried to bury Kiara in paperwork. They demanded 10 years of her emails. They deposed her for 8 hours, asking questions about her political affiliations, her voting record, her opinions on border policy. Kiara sat in the deposition room, a windowless box that smelled of stale coffee. Across from her was an assistant U.S. attorney who looked bored and annoyed. "Ms. Robinson," the attorney asked, flipping through a binder, "did you or did you not refuse a direct order from a federal agent?" "I refused an unlawful order," Kiara corrected him. "He did not have a judicial warrant." "But you aren't a lawyer, are you? How could you know the difference in the heat of the moment?" "I can read," Kiara said simply. "It said I-200 at the top, and I know my rights." The turning point came 6 months later. The civil rights firm had subpoenaed the body camera footage from the agents. Delaney had claimed in his report that his body camera was malfunctioning, or not activated, due to the sudden nature of the event. But there was a mistake in their cover-up. The second agent, the quiet one who had tapped his watch, had activated his camera. It was a pre-event buffer recording the 30 seconds of video captured before the audio turns on. The lawyers played the clip in a pre-trial hearing. It showed the agents in the SUV before they approached the school. In the silent video, Delaney is seen laughing. He checks his reflection in the rearview mirror. He adjusts his balaclava. He turns to the other agent and mimics kicking a door in. Then just as the audio kicks in, he says, "Let's go scare the hell out of these people. Maybe we'll find someone worth grabbing." There was no mention of a specific fugitive. No mention of probable cause or a suspect fleeing into the building. It was a fishing expedition. They were going to raid a school on a hunch, using fear as their warrant. The courtroom froze when the audio played. The judge, a stern woman who had been skeptical of the plaintiff's claims, initially took off her glasses. She looked at the defense table. The assistant U.S. attorney looked down at his notes, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. But the real nail in the coffin was the second anchor. During the deposition of the school's security logs, the plaintiff's team introduced the automated visitor log data. The system creates a distinct entry code for every visitor who is buzzed in, the lawyer explained to the jury later. But it also logs denied entry attempts if the camera detects motion, but the door is not released. The log showed that Delaney had been at the school 4 times in the previous month. Each time he had loitered at the door testing it. This wasn't a hot pursuit. It was a pattern of harassment. He was hunting for a soft target. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Kiara Robinson took the stand on the final day. She wore her favorite blazer, the one she wore for parent-teacher conferences. Ms. Robinson, her lawyer asked gently, "Why didn't you just open the door? It would have been easier." Kiara looked at the jury. She saw a diverse group of 12 people, a nurse, a mechanic, a retired librarian. "It would have been easier," she agreed. "But I teach my students that the Constitution protects everyone, not just some people, everyone. If I let them in, I'm teaching a lie. I stood there because the door was the only thing standing between my kids and a man who wanted to hurt them to feel powerful." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Kiara held hands with Principal Davies on one side and her brother on the other. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Kiara Robinson." The numbers followed. Compensatory damages $800,000. Punitive damages $10 million. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. $10 million in punitive damages. It was a message. It was a scream from the jury box telling the federal government that you cannot terrorize a schoolhouse. The aftermath was swift and brutal for the other side. Brock Delaney was placed on administrative leave, then fired as the internal affairs investigation forced by the public verdict uncovered a history of similar intimidation tactics. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a formal apology to the school district, a rare document that Principal Davies framed and hung in the front office. But the money wasn't the end of the story. Kiara Robinson didn't retire. She didn't move to an island. She showed up to school the next Monday. She walked past the new upgraded security vestibule. She waved to the security guard a new hire paid for by the district's revised safety budget. She walked into room 304. The students were already there. They went quiet when she entered. They had seen the news. They knew she was rich now. They knew she was famous. "Ms. Robinson," Marcus asked from the third row, "are you going to quit?" Kiara set her bag down. She pulled out the tray of seedlings for the hydroponic garden. She looked at the class, at the faces she had protected with nothing but a locked door and a shaky voice. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Now take out your notebooks. We have to finish the carbon cycle before the test on Friday." She used a portion of the settlement to endow a legal defense fund for educators facing similar threats. She bought new equipment for the science lab, and she kept teaching. The victory wasn't just the check. The victory was the precedent. It was the fact that across the country, school secretaries and principals taped a new cheat sheet next to their intercoms. A checklist that started with one simple question: do you have a warrant signed by a judge? And if the answer was no, the door stayed closed. Kiara Robinson proved that a single person standing in the right place refusing to move can be stronger than a tactical team. She proved that dignity is a fortress provided you have the courage to lock the gate. This story highlights a critical distinction in American law that every citizen, and especially every public employee, should understand. First, recognize the difference between an administrative warrant often used by immigration authorities and a judicial warrant. An administrative warrant is not signed by a judge and does not grant authority to enter private areas without consent. Next, remember that consent is the key. If you open the door or invite officers in, you may be waiving your Fourth Amendment protections. Furthermore, documentation is your strongest ally in any confrontation with authority. The presence of security cameras, visitor logs, and clear communication with legal counsel created an objective record that prevented the antagonist from rewriting the narrative. If you are in a position of responsibility, know your institution's specific protocols for law enforcement interaction before a crisis occurs. Finally, understand that true safety often relies on community solidarity and the willingness of individuals to calmly but firmly insist on proper legal procedure. Some elements are selectively fictionalized for education.